welcome to the third session of our Cycling and Society Virtual Symposium this year. My name's Luke, I work at the University of Salford, and I'm quite excited actually to chair this session today, Cycling and Local Economies, partly because I have a bit of a vested research interest in the area, which I'll go into in a couple of moments' time. As has been mentioned in previous sessions, this year's event is virtual for the obvious reasons that are going on at the moment, and so we've had to try and be a little bit creative in the way that we wanted to run it this year. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to look at the contributions, the presentations and so on of the panelists that we have here today, and we're hoping we won't have time to present the presentations as part of this session, but what we're hoping to do is go into a bit of in-depth discussion around those contributions very soon. The plan really is to I'll introduce each panelist and ask them to give a bit of a 1-minute introduction to or overview of their contribution, really hitting on sort of 2 or 3 of the key points of the findings of what they presented, and then we'll open it up to a bit more of a wider Q&A discussion session, which I'm happy to chair, and I'll provide a few questions, but I'm also really keen to get the discussion going with you guys and ask you to submit your questions as the discussion begins to evolve. So a few housekeeping things just to start off with. Technical info on Blackboard. So Blackboard is the software that we're using, that you're all on now. If you encounter any technical issues, it's best to raise them in the chat window, which you can access. In the bottom right of Blackboard, you should see sort of either a purple little arrow, or if the panel's open, you should see some options at the bottom of the screen, and the one on the left will be the chat window. If you type something in there and submit, then that should hopefully go to everyone who is attending today, and this will be a way that we're encouraging people to ask questions, make general points, share any relevant material that they think might be relevant to the discussion that's going on. And as I say, ask as many questions as you want to the panel. If you could try and preface any questions you have with just sort of a question dash or a Q dash, and then that will help me and also the panelists sort of pick out the questions when, as the discussion is going on, we can dip into the chat menu and pull these things out. Some of you might hear sound notifications, so every time a message is sent through in the chat window, you might hear a bit of a bing noise, a bit of a notification, which can get a little bit distracting and a little bit annoying. If you want to turn that off, again, if we go into the bottom right, into the control panel, and on the right-hand side, opposite the chat option, you should see a little wrench icon that says My Settings. If you click on that, and then go into the notification settings, you should be able to turn off notifications, audio notifications, and that will hopefully just make the experience a bit quieter for you, hopefully, because those kind of notifications can be a little bit distracting. We're hoping to record this session. We're recording all the sessions of the conference, and hopefully we'll be able to provide you access with those recordings for people who weren't able to attend previous sessions, or for anyone who wants to watch this session and to pull out particular points that are made in the discussions, that will be made available to you. Okay, so I'd like to, I thought the best way of starting this really is to put it over to the panelists for sort of a bit of an introduction and a bit of overview of their work. But before we do that, I just thought I'd also give a little bit of an introduction about myself. So, one extra thing, sorry. Yes, we are on Twitter at the hashtag C8S2020, and for those of you who like to tweet and use social media, please feel free to engage with that hashtag as much as you would like to. So I'll bring the webcams up now, so you should be able to see all the panelists. And before I move over to the panelists, as I was saying, I'd give it a bit of an introduction to myself. So my name's Luke. I work at the University of Salford as part of the Healthy Active Cities Research Group. And we, hosting this at Salford University, have been involved in the organisation of this virtual symposium along with our colleagues from other universities who we sort of form a partnership around organising this event. So yeah, I work in the Healthy Active Cities Research Group, and in about January, February time, we applied for some funding to sort of run a study into e-cargo bike use across Greater Manchester. And so we're in the middle of that project now. It's a fairly short scoping study, but it's looking at how e-cargo bikes are currently being used, how they could be used, why can't they be used, and really sort of trying to pick out those opportunities and potential and the barriers for different sectors of society, looking at businesses and healthcare and education and just general public use as well. And when we received sort of the fabulous contributions that we received for this symposium, we started grouping them up into themes, and we saw this sort of local economy and a sort of utility type of cycling was becoming a recurring theme, and so we thought we'd put this session together off the back of that. So it's one I'm interested in to open up the discussion. So yeah, moving it over to the panelists. I'll ask them to introduce themselves. If you could tell us your name, your sort of affiliation, or who you're sort of associated with today. And if you could just give a sort of 3 or 4 of the key points from your presentation, a bit of an overview of what it is that you contributed, which is now on our website, for those who haven't been able to watch them. That would be fab. And so could I start with Claire, if that's okay? Sure.
So yeah, I'm Claire Stocks, and I live in South Manchester, and I'm here representing both Walk Ride Greater Manchester, which is a campaigning network, and Chorlton Bike Deliveries, which was a volunteer scheme we set up in Chorlton where I live during COVID. The on the site is about what we learned by the scheme, which was to deliver shopping to local households during COVID, particularly people who were shielding. And also we work with a lot of food banks and moving waste food around Chorlton and helping with the provision of meals for people who couldn't, don't find it so easy to do that themselves. I think the 2 key things I wanted to pick out, one was I think what COVID has done has really made quite a big transformation, I think, away from city centres towards local neighbourhood centres like Chorlton. We're a district centre with a strong trading base, and I think this is a real opportunity for carbon reductions in transport. Lots of people either working from home and more connected to their local community, but also wanting to support their local community because of lockdown and feeling part of that sort of mutual aid response. So that's an opportunity to see carbon reductions in transport, because if we can help people shop local through providing cargo bike deliveries from local shops, then that reduces carbon emissions. But I think there's much wider implications than that. And then the second thing I wanted to pick out was about, we got into this scheme to help our community, but also because we all believed in reducing carbon emissions from transport. And I think the thing we found is it's been much easier to have conversations about the climate, about reductions, when you're actually doing something, contributing to your community, than when you're just turning up, knocking on a door and going, hello, can I talk to you about how you can reduce your carbon emissions? Not that I think anyone should do that. So and particularly with traders, so we're now seen as part of the trading community in Chorlton, and traders, I think we've got a big role to play in help traders understand that they're actually increasing walking and cycling is good for business. I don't think that is widely perceived. So again, we found that a lot easier to do by contributing to the economy than just being a sort of campaigning group.
Thanks, Claire. That's great. That's something I'm really interested in maybe picking out a little bit later on, actually, is that contributing to the local economy as a sort of force of positive change rather than just through the traditional campaigning routes. I think it's a particularly really interesting way of sort of tackling and approaching these kind of subjects. Robbie, can I ask you to come in and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Luke. Hi, everyone. I'm Robbie Napper. I'm from Monash University in Melbourne. It's 11 p.m. here. My kids have just woken up too. That's exciting. I'm an industrial designer, and my focus is on the design of vehicles for sustainable transport. So I've done a lot of work in public transport and bicycles. For this symposium, I wanted to talk about what people do when they're on board bikes. So one of my jobs is to try and imagine a better future where perhaps people use bicycles a little more. We have very low mode share in Australia. And what we did is we've asked participants to film themselves undertaking utility trips. And that's the local part of my research. So we know that people who use bicycles in Australia, those few that do, I should say, tend to use them for commuting. And there's a really big gap in usage around local journeys. Australians drive very short journeys. It's terrible, really. Beautiful climate, flat land, all this sort of stuff, and can't get them out of their cars. So I thought that for the people who are cycling these very short trips, short meaning under 5 kilometers and many under 2 kilometers, it would be interesting to know the sorts of things that people actually have to do. And this was really to test out the hypothesis, I suppose, that it might actually be quite easy for people to ride short trips, provided they had the right equipment. The problem in Australia is that cycling is sort of framed as a sport by a lot of people. And, we've got the Tour on at the moment, don't we? And you can't really go to the shops on one of these types of sports bikes, or you can go to the shop, but you don't want to lock it up because it's worth too much money and it has no cargo carrying capacity, not even a carton of milk. So we investigated that, and really the two findings that stood out so far. The first one was that the characteristics of these trips are very, very different, and they're completely at odds with this sports framing of cycling. So the trips are slow and they're short, and a really high proportion of the trip is actually transactional. It's not riding at all. It's parking and loading up with groceries and children, and these sorts of things. So that was interesting. The second thing that was interesting is, although I'm very, very interested in vehicles, of course, that makes me quite interested in infrastructure and other things as well. And it was fascinating how the riders of the bikes had to undertake a lot of minor tasks when the infrastructure changed or degraded. So if you change from a cycleway to a shared street, for example, there's this, we noticed in our videos, a clustering of tasks: head checks, changing gears, braking, ringing the bell, waving, all sorts of things happening all at once. And it was really intense. Nigel asks, do we have rucksacks in Australia? No, we don't. We call them backpacks, but I get your point. We certainly do have those sorts of things. It's getting people to use them. And maybe we'll talk a bit about that in the future of this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Robbie. And yeah, for anyone who hasn't had a chance to watch Robbie's contribution, I highly recommend it. There's some really interesting video footage where he has flipped the camera around of a cyclist on their journey, and you're sort of looking at them as they're sort of experiencing that journey for themselves. It's very disorientating at the beginning, but then when you start to realize all of the different things that are going on in that sort of transaction, it's quite interesting. Makes you reflect, I think, on cycling as an experience. I'd also like to extend an extra thank you for staying up until midnight, and I apologise if this event has woken your children up. But thank you.
It's fine. It's a lot easier than flying.
Yes, that is true. Claudio, can I bring you in?
Yes, of course, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Claudio Sarmiento. I'm a PhD student, well, finishing at the University of Toronto. And my submission actually is a small part of my dissertation research. I wanted to take the opportunity to sort of get on this creative side of the symposium, which is I've always liked, and provide sort of a snippet of what I experienced during 2 years of observations in Mexico City on this research subject that I call the bicycle traits. Well, that I translated to bicycle trades. In Mexico, a lot of people call it bici oficios, which is interesting because a lot of the use of bicycles and cargo tricycles in Mexico are not entirely linked to street trades, but culturally and symbolically, they are in the minds of a lot of Mexicans. So, for example, a lot of breakfasts that we have here, like sweetbreads and tamale and atole, and all of very on-the-go type of meals that people have every day in the streets of Mexico City, are associated with a cargo tricycle. And these vendors, I guess you can call them, come up to you. You don't find them. Bicycle trades, bicycle trades are really part of a streetscape. So I wanted to represent that with sort of the sounds of the street, and the sights of how you can find them by looking, only if you're looking at the fact that they all have some sort of bicycle. And I've since come back to Mexico. It's 8 a.m. here, so it's not that bad, not as bad as Robbie. It's actually really refreshing, but that means I missed a little bit the previous sessions. But yeah, I think other than the cultural and social landscape that bicycle trades represent in Mexico, I also wanted to highlight, which is basically at the core of my research, which is that these street actors, even though they're very valued to the local economy, especially the base economy of blue-collar workers in Mexico, they're very much marginalized. They're seen as informal, if not illegal, vendors. And that comes from two parts. One is their omission in basically street policies or planning policies, which is my PhD is in planning, sorry about that. But also from this assumption that cycling should only be this type of commuter cycling reserved for the elites that resemble Amsterdam or Copenhagen, I don't know. So this type of other uses of the bicycle are really not well understood and not well, I guess, categorized. And I think that they need to be decolonized from this idea that the bicycle has only one function. So hopefully, again, maybe you can talk more about this, Ron.
Yeah, thanks, Claudia. I think the function of bikes is a really interesting point of discussion, and it's something that I pulled out of watching your presentation. Actually, was quite interested to see how the use of cargo bikes was so varied. And how I think one of the points you made was how a lot of people don't actually ever ride the bikes; they use them just to sort of move things around or to be present in, as a practical tool rather than as a sort of bicycle in that traditional sense.
That's right.
I think quite interesting. And last but not least, Georgia, could I ask you to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Georgia Kaur, and I'm a transport planner at the London Borough of Ealing. My job is to encourage and promote sustainable and active transport, but primarily cycling. So in my day job, I work on a wide range of projects, varying from kind of behaviour change schemes such as the Livable Neighbourhoods, which is all about encouraging kind of local journeys to be made sustainably, to running cargo bike trials. So it's really interesting to hear about your findings. So the research I presented wasn't conducted as part of my day job. I was actually given a bursary by the Transport Planning Society to carry out a piece of research on on-demand food deliveries and kind of their impacts and possible solutions to their contributions to the climate crisis. So what I did was I surveyed food riders in London and did some semi-structured interviews with them. And the background behind that was that we simply didn't know how these journeys in London were being made. So the only body of research was conducted by TfL back in 2007, which showed that 92% of these journeys were made by powered two-wheelers, so mopeds and motorbikes, which even though they're small in size, they emit emissions, and that's really important to remember, really. I think they're often kind of forgotten about quite simply due to their size, and they're kind of put in a box of just looking at from a road safety perspective, but it also needs to be considered in terms of all of these kind of localized trips that they contribute to. So what my research found was that, in fact, from 2007, there have been some improvements in terms of kind of the modal share. It's slightly reduced in terms of the power two-wheelers dominance, but 52% of riders still use power two-wheelers. It shows that we've obviously still got a long way to go. And a range of factors influence this, from kind of the individual's own circumstances to kind of the larger kind of cultural norms that are associated with these modes, the kind of the infrastructure on the ground, but also kind of the benefits that they have access to due to their employment rights. So because many of them they are situated in the gig economy, they don't have access to sustainable travel schemes such as the cycle to work scheme that could really kind of break down the cost of owning a bike and incentivize their use. But I think probably the key finding of the paper was that I tried to kind of get feedback from companies themselves to see what they're doing to encourage sustainable transport, and wasn't able to get hold of anyone. So what I did was a desk-based review to understand their actions, what they've done, what they're currently doing, what they're potentially going to be doing. And as a result of this, it was shown that Deliveroo specifically since July 2019 introduced something called vehicle priority. And what this was is when riders kind of go to book their upcoming shifts, the algorithm that allocates these shifts was favouring motorised vehicles, so cars and mopeds. And as a result of this, all of the cyclist riders kind of got the last dibs of the shifts, and therefore, as they're kind of in the gig economy, the amount of income they were receiving was less. So that was the main finding, and as a result of this, I put forward a series of recommendations that the companies themselves could adopt, but also practitioners from kind of local government to central government could enact to encourage more of these journeys to be made by muscles instead of motors.
Thanks, Georgia. That's really interesting. I think the term vehicle priority says it all, doesn't it, really? And I think maybe that's something that we could probably get onto at some point a little bit later on. Okay, thank you all for those introductions and that review of your contributions. I think it's been really helpful to sort of lay that landscape, lay the frame, lay the groundwork. I suppose as the chair, I'll open things up with a bit of a general question, really. I suppose it's been touched upon in the earlier sessions for those who were able to join us, but obviously, certainly in the UK, and I think in larger parts around the world as well, we've seen significant changes in engagement with walking and cycling during the COVID pandemic around the world. Whether it be through increased cycling or pop-up infrastructure to accommodate more social distancing, however that looks across the world, I think it's been taking place on quite a wide scale. And so thinking about that in this context, I'll sort of throw this out to all the panelists really to jump in. But have you seen a change in the relationship between cycling and the local economy during COVID-19? So I suppose in fact, I might ask Claire to come in with this one first, because I know that in some respects your whole project really has been born out of this relationship, hasn't it, Claire, with the Chorlton bike delivery? So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that. Sorry, Claire, I think you might be muted. You might have to put your mic on.
Sorry, yeah, I was typing, so I muted. I think what we've seen is that, you know, the government has now announced £2 billion for emergency active travel measures over the next few years. The Gear Change report has set out big commitments to create, you know, Active Travel England, which will have teeth. What isn't quite happening on the ground is local councils kind of following through on that. They've now got clear design guidance. There's new design guidance that's been put out there. So we're not yet seeing the infrastructure that's needed. But I think what's really important here is that I think the landscape has moved on from where the conversation needs to be. We need the conversation about quality infrastructure. We need campaigners, studying maps and planning applications and saying that's not good enough. But what we really need is more focus on how we kind of activate communities and how we show cycling as a positive thing, and it's not just a hardcore niche of cyclists. Unfortunately, there is a really negative perception, particularly on Twitter, of a certain type of cyclist, and a lot of the sort of that's become a kind of lightning rod for opposition to some of these schemes that are potentially going in. So the big role that I think schemes like mine and other schemes can play is showing cycling as a utility function, as a way to enable people who can't get to the shops to get their shopping, people who are shielding. It's been really interesting. We've actually found that a lot of the people who want to volunteer for us to cycle aren't your hardcore cyclists either. We've had a lot of older people, a bit of time on their hands, they want to do something with purpose, maybe get themselves active. So I think, to summarise, I think what's useful is to move cycling out of the position as a niche luxury activity for a certain tiny subsection, and to move cycling into being about utility, about enabling people, about everyday people who've got tasks to perform, like shopping. A lot of the cycling industry is focused on a very narrow activity. It's that luxury leisure behaviour. And cycling, when it was invented 150 years ago, or whatever, it was like a working class revolution, and the suffragettes used it to win the vote, and we need the bike to be seen in that sort of way. So.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Yeah, I think that sort of wider perception around cycling is an interesting one, and I wonder if I can throw this over to you, Robbie, sort of from the perspective of sort of bike design, utility cycling, if you have sort of anything to weigh in around that.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think to follow on from Claire's comments, it is interesting how different societies sort of frame cycling. So history is interesting, isn't it? We can go back to cycling as an emancipator. We can go back even further when it was a rich person's plaything. So it's interesting how we go through these waves. To answer your question, though, I think that the interesting change in the local economy that we've seen here in Melbourne, to me, COVID has exposed some interesting things. I think it's really scratched beneath the surface of a couple of our deeply seated cultural kind of treatments. So I can go to a hardware store here in Melbourne. We're in a very strict sort of lockdown scenario, but I'm only allowed to go shopping there if I'm in a car. And if I show up on my cargo bike, they are quite nonplussed. And earlier in the year, I was refused healthcare for showing up on a bike instead of a car, even though our road rules recognise both as vehicles. They don't distinguish. So I think we've learned some interesting things there, that just how deeply ingrained this sort of the car as a default form of transport goes in our societies. That's been the case here. I think it's the case in a lot of the English-speaking world. So that's been interesting. Your second point about the nature of the bicycles is quite interesting too. So look, a good deal of our bikes here really are sort of unfit for purposes of carrying anything human, which is a shame really, because it is too much modification to be a bit more useful. And I think the comment about rucksacks is very good as well. So I think what it represents is sort of an opportunity for a mindset change. And I suppose that relates to what Claire was saying too. If we can just adjust the mindset and adjust the equipment and perhaps the infrastructure and a few other things, not separately, but perhaps at the same time, perhaps we might set up some kind of self-reinforcing type of behavior, which might be a bit more useful.
Yeah, I think the conversation about that role of infrastructure is quite an interesting one, and it's interesting that you brought it up there actually, because it's a question I wanted to pose to Claudia actually, in regards to Mexico particularly, because I think there was a point in the presentation, Claudia, where I think you mentioned that cargo bikes have been present in the city for a very long time, since maybe the 18th century or the early 19th century. And so I was wondering if from that infrastructure, the bike has been present historically, and so with that historic presence, has that meant that infrastructure has grown alongside it, or infrastructure is just not a consideration?
It's interesting. Yeah, the cargo bike has been present in Mexico sort of as a makeshift way. Mexico followed this path like many other countries, where it was an elite recreational toy, basically, that was passed down to, I guess, the lower classes to use, and then those people were very ingenious in soldering pieces together. So they would have made this like side shanks, or little sidecars, or little sidecars, annexes, makeshift things, really, to expand their function, because many of these people in the lower classes use their bicycles for work as well. And then we had in Mexico a period in the middle of the 20th century where the city was not large enough so that it warranted a car for everywhere. The cities, especially Mexico City, but it was not small enough so that you can carry things like soft drinks bottles around with a sort of a push cart. So the cargo tricycle was a staple for soda companies to deliver the soda bottles everywhere. So that sort of got upended when Mexico adopted a very US-oriented suburban type of development that not only necessitated long car trips, but also it meant that industries, whereas they were located in the core of the city, got pushed to the periphery. So yeah, there was a time where infrastructure was sort of adapted to a bike culture. We actually have a saying here in Mexico, when cities are small enough and they're not modernized, that they're pueblos bicicleteros, like bike towns, that they're like too anachronistic, not up to the times. And it's derogatory, but now it's like whimsical. And now speaking about COVID, I want to just answer that in Mexico, we've lost, it is estimated we've lost over 2 million formal jobs over COVID. And one of the sort of economies that take the brunt of the work of those layoffs are street vending. And street vending with cargo tricycles, because of how affordable they are, is becoming more commonplace. But at the same time, sort of the elites in the wealthiest parts of Mexico City, and this is a recent development, it's like maybe 3 weeks old, associate more street vending with less hygiene, and I don't know what the link there is, to more a higher risk for COVID infections. So they're getting them removed. There was a news article that basically a mayor of a borough of Mexico City boasted that he decommissioned 140 cargo tricycles, and he was gonna put them to waste. So that caused an uproar, obviously.
Yeah, I can imagine that would be a lot of cargo tricycles to have to deal with. Georgia, could I sort of bring you in and sort of ask you to sort of how have you seen things change sort of in Ealing over the past few months?
So the past few months in Ealing, we've seen an increase in number of people cycling, definitely, as kind of many councils across the UK in particular kind of putting in COVID infrastructure, so ranging from pop-up cycle lanes to kind of low traffic neighbourhoods, school streets, a whole host of measures. And I think a lot of councils in particular have been focusing kind of on our high streets, due to the fact that obviously we're expecting more people to go there, but also to support the local economy. And in the context of London specifically, I mean, it's really a really interesting dynamic, because obviously you have these kind of major shopping hubs like the Westfields of the world, but you also have a declining high street. And kind of the provision of infrastructure to kind of local high streets is really important. I mean, kind of cycle parking alone, I think I think TfL found some figure that it creates 5 times the amount of retail spend per square metre in comparison to a car parking space. So it really highlights the benefits of the economic benefits to the local business in particular that walking and cycling can bring to the local economy. So I think that'll be a kind of a really interesting understanding, particularly kind of picking up on Claire's point that many people now are kind of staying in the suburbs, and you know, are they going to return to kind of these inner city areas to do their shopping, or will they actually remain kind of in their local areas? One thing I do think is interesting in the context of the UK is that I think there's kind of like a kind of an ingrained behaviour that people kind of tend to do their food shop in particular on kind of one day a week, or do a big shop, and they kind of use that as an excuse to get into their cars. Whereas when you look at places like the Netherlands, many people do their food shop over a number of days and kind of do these repeat shorter trips, and I think that's got a real huge part to play as well in kind of spurring and promoting the local economy.
I think that's a really good point, actually, to bring in sort of a wider discussion around infrastructure. I've noticed there's been a few comments coming in and a couple of questions in the chat about this subject. So I'll pick out one of them from Mitali. And she asks, many cities and countries are investing in creating more infrastructure, but what kind of infrastructure should the investment be in, considering that the majority of cycling happening currently is recreational, and so investing in commuter cycling might not turn out to be as profitable. So what sort of kind of infrastructure should we be looking to invest in? And I'm guessing the answer to this might change. You know, we have a few panelists from different corners of the world, so I'm sure there might be some different viewpoints on this. Could I open that up to the panelists if anyone wants to jump in? Claire?
Yeah, sure. I'll have a go. Oh, thank you. Yeah, Claire, you go.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think this is a really good question, because I think in the UK, I think the move and investment in what we're calling here low traffic neighbourhoods is the right call, because I think that enables a lot more than just cycling. It enables people to get around on foot and more easily with wheelchairs and buggies. And it's about a lot of what the research that's been done, and in Greater Manchester in particular, the focus is on short journeys. That's where we need to make a big change in behaviour. So not journeys that you can't cycle that are 10 miles, but just journeys of a kilometre or less, which in Greater Manchester, a third of those trips are driven. And so the way that you do that is not through 3-mile commuter routes to the city centre, which, by the way, will need less, but through enabling people to get around their own neighbourhood. And in Chorlton, where my scheme is and where I live, we're bisected by 2 main roads like that. It completely segregates our community and makes it harder to get around. So I think that's where the investment should go, because then if you reduce cars, you actually need less bike protection anyway. So it's much more cost effective. I've heard councillors speak privately about this in Greater Manchester, saying that they wish they'd clocked this earlier and were investing more in this earlier. This was before COVID. That's not to say you don't need routes, but yeah, low traffic neighbourhoods are where it's at for sure.
Oh, thanks, Claire. Robbie, you were going to jump in as well, I think.
Oh, sure. Look, I'll be brief, but because I agree with everything Claire said as well, and I was going to say some similar things, but the perspective in Melbourne has been that it would be good to grow cycling no matter what. Our sort of national advocacy organisation wants just people getting on a bike, because I think once you're familiar with the balance, the biomechanics, and you own a bike and it's in reasonable running order, then you're far more likely to use it for something else. And if that something else is commuting or is recreational or is going to the shops, that I think that we don't have the numbers, but the general likelihood of you using that bicycle at some other time would be good as well. So I think, you know, at a certain point, we can all just get out the Cro manual and make sure we've got this great interconnected, wonderful network, and then the challenge becomes applying that in our cultures. We can't transplant something from a very different bicycle culture. Although I would say that the work that's going on in the UK has been very influential in Australia. For a long time, if I walked into a meeting with the Crow Manual, people would say, yes, but Netherlands, that's like designing on the moon. You're not going to do it. Whereas if I take the London Cycling Guide, it's not, we're a Commonwealth country. It's culturally, it's not a million miles away anymore. So that's been an interesting translational thing that's happened in Australia.
Yeah, that's something I hadn't actually thought about before, is sort of, drawing that inspirational research from communities or cultures of society that are more similar to your own, and therefore maybe that language or sentiment translates a little bit better across when you're trying to...
Yeah, look, there's an aspiration for the Dutch or the Danish stuff, but it's so far in our future that people need a more grounded target, I think, at times.
Yeah, absolutely. Georgia or Claudio, would you like to come in on any of those points?
Yeah, I have a small comment, which is that I don't know if this is the case in Australia and the UK, but when we talk about cycling infrastructure in Mexico City, people, especially public officials, tend to think about bikeways only, like the lane in the street, and sort of it shifts the conversation towards if there's enough space for that, or if motor vehicles should indeed be the space for them should be reduced. Whereas I think cycling infrastructure is way more broader than that, and I think that connects with your research, Luke, because when you think about cargo tricycles and the fact that they're slower, they park more often, and yeah, probably with Bobby as well, that they do more loading and unloading than riding actually. Then the conversation is more about parking and about spaces where that can happen without like going into the sidewalk pedestrian areas or close to the crosswalks. And I think that may be even more important for bicycle uptake than just painting bicycle lanes all over and expecting like people to ride endlessly.
Yeah, that's definitely something I've been finding from the research I'm doing actually, is that the sort of perceptions of cargo bikes. So, one of the first barriers really is that people don't really know what they are. And so we have to get over that hump before we can then get into the wider sort of utility cycling arguments. But when we look at infrastructure as well, I found that from people that have been using cargo bikes that I've spoken to so far, and maybe Claire might have something to come in on this, or possibly Georgia, is that the infrastructure for cargo bikes seems to be similar to sort of the infrastructure needs of people who use wheelchairs. So, for example, we have a lot of great off-road cycling infrastructure in the UK that is along canal towpaths, along canals or along rivers. But often to access that, you need to go through a fairly short fence that's designed for a walker or someone with a small bike. But there's no way you can get it's very difficult sometimes to get a wheelchair through there, and likewise very difficult sometimes to get a cargo bike through there. And so thinking about infrastructure beyond just the personal bicycle, I think, is an important consideration maybe moving forward. I could see you nodding there, Georgia. I didn't know if there's anything you wanted to
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. I think also kind of linking back to Claire's point, that kind of the future of what our kind of local suburbs are going to look like is going to really tie in nicely with that, because with kind of the advent of low traffic neighbourhoods and people kind of staying kind of in these more suburban and local areas, it's very likely then that kind of cargo bikes may become more prevalent, particularly in the UK and in the London setting, because quite simply that there are fewer cars in these kind of residential streets. So you're very likely to see more people using cargo bikes for the school run or kind of local deliveries. So I think that will be a really kind of interesting consequence to see as a result of COVID. But I completely agree. I think in regards to kind of the same accessibility requirements, how kind of cargo bikes are grouped, And for a lot of kind of the COVID pop-up related schemes, I think we've seen councils up and down the country where previously kind of on like a main road, you'd have a mandatory cycle lane that was very, very kind of slim. And they've used this opportunity where they're going to put up kind of pop-up infrastructure to make that bigger and make that more accessible and actually make that segregated, so it doesn't just kind of fit the generic cyclist as such, but expand that. So I think there is appreciation there, that kind of there is not one cyclist, like everyone's a cyclist, and it's so far ranging in its definition.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I think maybe just to a point, it goes beyond that as well. When we can think about infrastructure as one thing, but I mentioned about sort of the perception problem of cargo bikes. This might be something that I'd throw over to Claire, actually. Would you like to come in, Claire? I think you might be muted again, Claire.
I came to a very interesting presentation by someone at your university, Luke, on the rise of the projected rise of mobility scooters used by older people because of our rising aging population. And I think this is a key area that we need to see, as someone has posted in the chat, these need to be seen as mobility lanes. I totally agree. And if you look at the demographic studies about what's happening to our population in the UK and many European countries, we're getting older. For people to be more active longer, a lot of the debate about low traffic neighbourhoods is, people need cars to get around. Well, they don't actually. They may do, but a micro scooter is a great solution, and there's space on there for shopping, and the projected growth of those is massive. So I think we need to see lanes and infrastructure as about mums with prams, cargo bikes, mobility scooters, and cargo bikes as well. And so the barriers, removing all the barriers would be a great start, just getting rid of all the crappy gates that stop people getting through them.
Yeah, I have many personal experience with those gates. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, in that conversation about accessibility and diversity with all of this, I think, is become increasingly pronounced over the last few months, but I think it's also important to keep the momentum behind of this going as well. And maybe part of these events that we're holding today and tomorrow are part of that, but also just the wider conversations we have in our daily lives. Because I think the perception is the perception of utility cycling and cargo bikes, particularly from my sort of experience, is still a little bit of a mountain to climb. We're getting there in sort of pro cycling neighbourhoods in the UK, but there's still sort of areas where cycling numbers are already low. Cargo bikes still feel as though they might be a million miles away in terms of getting people to understand them and sort of accept them being on the roads. I've just seen a question come in the comments that I think sort of taps into some of the things we've just been talking about. Are there, and I don't know if anyone knows the answer to this, but are there any low traffic neighbourhoods being developed in the UK outside of London? Loads. Yeah, okay. I think that was I think that question might have come from Nikki. Do you have any that you could, in Greater Manchester, that you could talk about, Claire, that you know about?
We've got a few. There's quite a controversial one in Levenshulme, which is a good example of perhaps the opposition that can come up when people perceive something to be happening. Roads being closed when the whole idea is to open them up to make the neighbourhood permeable. So that's actually been delayed while more engagement is carried out. There are a number of other schemes in Beswick, in Urmston, in the Heatons, in Stockport, and that's just where we live. So I think I've heard somebody say that in London there's something like 800 low traffic neighbourhoods planned, which sounded a crazy figure, but there are lots up and down the country, and I believe there was someone on Twitter who's curating a map. So I can't remember who it was, but somebody will know and post it in the chat. I don't know. I wanted to pose a sort of question to the group about online stuff. I'm taking us off at a tangent here, but my perception is that one thing that we've really got to sort if we want to have more cargo bike deliveries is online shopping. So how do we make sure that the big jump to online shopping doesn't just become a jump to online delivery by car and van as a default? And so we found that difficult in Chiltern. A lot of our traders aren't online, so we work with them to provide a sort of tailored solution. If they were taking online orders, we could provide more deliveries. And I just think this is a big thing for, like, if we're going to make cargo bikes a thing, then we've got to provide that kind of that online side of things. So I just wondered if people had studied that or had any perspectives on that. Maybe Georgia. Sorry if that's taken a step, but I felt it's a really important point for this topic, online shopping.
I think that is a really important topic and something that can't be missed. I mean, who knows kind of what the next few months and weeks look like. If it involves a local lockdown, again, people are likely going to be jumping onto the web to order whatever they want. But kind of in terms of a local perspective, I completely agree with some of the comments you made. It's really hard kind of to kind of arrange kind of for these services to be done kind of on a mass basis, and kind of ensuring that kind of businesses themselves are set up to receive kind of online payments and so forth. I think that in order to kind of achieve something there, it would probably require a kind of larger work with local kind of business improvement districts to kind of coordinate that. I know everywhere has them, but they would have quite a good power and kind of organisation already set up to communicate with the businesses. Something I've seen previously is that Sainsbury's ran a cargo bike trial. I believe it was in London somewhere, and it was hugely successful. So it was quite interesting to see the shift even from kind of like a big supermarket to start considering that. And I know also Waitrose has recently kind of signed up Deliveroo to start conducting local journeys. I mean, from my research alone, you'd hope that'd be bikes, who knows? But I think there is a real shift now that because people, as I say, kind of still kind of living at home and thinking about their local area and exploring it more, we are potentially likely to see kind of local people taking it into their own hands. And I know for one, kind of from a London perspective, I've seen it, and I've seen it on Twitter, kind of, and I've seen it in the comments. Bikeworks is kind of a local cycle training provider. And what they started doing in Hounslow was started delivering kind of prescriptions to local people. So I don't know if there's an answer as such, but I think it's definitely something that we're likely going to see kind of now going forwards and becoming more of a topic that needs to be explored, because the kind of environmental implication there are huge potentially.
Thanks, Georgia. I think the point you raised, Claire, is a really important one. It's something that I saw work with cargo bikes is, particularly in lockdown in the UK, there was sort of two main sort of important elements about the role of technology in all of this, which is maybe a way of looking at it, a lens to look at it through, which is that a lot of traders didn't have online shops at the time, and therefore people who were vulnerable weren't able to order things online, and then they weren't able to get them delivered either, because cargo bike deliveries wouldn't have been able to be possible because an online shop wasn't in place in the first place. And it was this sort of like awkward rotating problem that eventually I think people found solutions to, luckily. Thinking about that sort of role of technology and online shopping within the local economy, Robbie or Claudia, is there anything you'd like to come in on around that?
I can probably paint a picture of what's happened in Melbourne very briefly. We've got a really high uptake of online shopping. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't seem like we've got the problem at that front end like Claire's described. The interesting thing here has been that all the online shopping has defaulted to essentially motorized, white van delivery. So we've got the online, we haven't got the bikes. It seems like you've got the bikes and you haven't got the online. So that's the story down this way. Look, I'm generalizing, of course, which is both useful and inaccurate, but that's my experience. I can order pretty much anything online from a local business within a 5 kilometre radius of where I live at the moment, and it'll be delivered, but sure as eggs, it'll be delivered in a white van, not a bike.
Yeah, I'd also like to comment that, and actually, Cosmin just commented on that. Here in Mexico, I actually wanted to comment on Georgia's work. It was awesome. That here in Mexico, a Twitter handle which has this very funny name. It's called basically in Spanish, Kittens Against Inequality. They basically use kitten photos and put facts about inequality in Mexico. But they actually conducted the research on delivery men in Mexico City, because on the topic of labor rights, because we have sort of the technology by osmosis from the US. Several platforms are available and were widely used even before COVID. But with COVID, those services sort of jumped. And it just so happens that the people performing these deliveries are low income, basically the more vulnerable populations. The survey actually includes a skin color tone graph that's called like the Pearl scale or something like that, because they have this inkling that the browner that they are, the more likely that they're engaged in this very easy to conduct but very high risk activities without any labor protections. So I guess that more than a technology platform, at least here in Mexico, we need like some kind of safeguards. And I think from your infographic, Georgia, also like some kind of incentive to not have these deliveries done by motor vehicles. Given that a lot of people have more ready access to bicycles, and that for the longest time the streets here were empty and it was great, and now they've come back and half of the fleet is basically delivery people in vans and cars and motorcycles especially.
Well, that's really interesting to hear the comparison. I think, yeah, it's the same kind of applies over here. I'd say that because the cycling and kind of all food on-demand food couriers are part of the gig economy, they're without access to lots of the rights that they really should be provided. So, but those that kind of food riders that currently ride a motorbike, for instance, because they don't have access to sick pay, if they kind of resonated with those that may be feeling a little bit apprehensive about cycling and perhaps there's not great infrastructure near them, it's very likely to kind of encourage them to start cycling. So I find it kind of, when I really looked in and explored it, it was kind of like a self-perpetuating circle, really, that there's so many factors that influence their choice, but in part it is due to the lack of rights that they're given. And as you say, they're such a high-risk group. So kind of, I just find it appalling that these vulnerable groups are kind of put in these positions, particularly in this period, and as we've touched upon, potentially going forwards as well, as kind of COVID situation continues.
Thanks, Georgia. Looking at the time, I can see that our time today is almost up. But I think what we just finished on there is a great sort of representation, really, of just how far-reaching and perhaps much wider this sort of discussion around cycling and the local economy is than people realise. You know, I think we've talked about some of the usual suspects today, such as infrastructure and sort of the accessibility of that infrastructure, maybe certain design of bike types as well. But I think it runs much deeper than that. Sort of almost the invisible parts of society, you know, whether that be sort of people's rights and their sort of ability to access certain things, but also just the technology side of all of this as well, and how all that works together. I guess if we had more time, I'd love to open up a conversation about sort of the perceptions of cyclists and the perceptions of different kinds of cyclists and cargo bikes who are technically employees and at work compared to cyclists who are just sort of going about their daily business, sort of recreationally speaking, and how those perceptions of people, how those perceptions change as well, which I think is an interesting one. But alas, we don't have the time. So I'd just like to thank you all, Claire, Robbie, Claudia, and Georgia, for joining me today. I think it's been a really interesting set of discussions from around the world, impressively. Yeah, I hope everyone's enjoyed this discussion as much as I have. Before I sort of end the session, I'll just bring back up the slide just to show our schedule for the rest of the afternoon and tomorrow. So we're going to take a half an hour break now and come back at 3:30 in the UK at least for the fourth and final session today called Cycling for All. And there will also be a Zoom social, which I think we're going to send an invitation round at some point. At 5 o'clock as well, but our next session is in half an hour. And so I'd just like to extend my thanks once again to the panelists who have been brilliant, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day and the next session if you attend it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Luke.
Thanks, Luke.